Okay, so as you probably know, it is 100 years since the partition of Ireland. It's also 100 years since the Irish soccer split. And Cormac Moore is a historian, an author, and has literally written the book on the subject. I'm delighted to welcome him back to the show now. Cormac, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Owen.
So take us back to the Irish Cup semi-final of 1921. For people who don't know the story, what happened?
So in January, the Irish Football Association, the IFA, which was the governing body for the whole island of Ireland at that stage, its Protest and Appeals Committee decided, because of the unrest in Dublin, because of the war of independence that was happening at that time, it was too unsafe for teams to travel from the north to Dublin. And it stipulated that all cup competitions would be played in Belfast. So in March 1921, March 7th, Shelbourne played Glenavon, a Lurgan-based team. They played each other in Belfast, and it ended up a draw. Now, the Shelbourne and Leinster Football Association automatically assumed, because it was a draw, the replay would be held in Dublin. That was the norm, going back the last 40 years. However, the IFA decided, no, you have to come back to Belfast again. And Shelbourne decided, with the support of the Leinster Football Association, that they wouldn't go back, and they were subsequently disqualified from the Irish Cup. But what happened afterwards was that the Leinster Football Association decided to leave the IFA and subsequently formed the Football Association of Ireland, the FAI, a number of months later.
How much were these sort of tensions simmering under the surface up until this point, that if it wasn't going to be this incident, it would have been another incident weeks or months later?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point, Owen. This was just a catalyst, but the reality was there was a lot of bitterness between Dublin and Belfast. Most Dublin supporters and administrators and footballers believed that there was a Belfast bias within the IFA in terms of who got selected for the Irish team in international matches, the venues for when Ireland held matches, the actual representation in the IFA Council and its subcommittees. There seemed to be a very strong bias towards Belfast clubs and personnel, and if it didn't happen in 1921, it more than likely would have happened in some other juncture.
I know you've made the point before that the Irish soccer split and the partition of Ireland on a political level are totally different things. That, of course, there was plenty of politics happening in the football associations themselves, but it was a different sort of politics. At the same time, I'm curious to know how those in Belfast, first of all, were leaning politically. Was it a largely unionist cohort of people running football in Belfast?
Yeah, no, and I have argued, and in my PhD thesis have argued, as well as my book, The Irish Soccer Split, that the primary reason for the soccer split was internal politics. But that is not to say that there were no other factors like the national political environment. And yes, most of the administrators from Belfast were unionists in outlook. For example, James Wilton, the chairperson, he had been in the UFF. He subsequently became the Ulster Unionist councillor and Lord Mayor of Derry City. And many of the other personnel were unionists in outlook. Even though they were unionists in outlook, they still didn't believe that football should be partitioned. They still believed Ireland should remain, all of Ireland should remain in the Empire, and they wanted football to remain an All-Ireland body. They were, and they stuck with the name, the Irish Football Association. They believed they had the right to select players from all over the island up until they were stopped doing that by FIFA. But although they're unionists in outlook, they still believed the IFA should be an All-Ireland body. But one of the reasons for the split was certainly the Dublin administrators and supporters and footballers believed it was a unionist organisation. In fact, there had been an incident just a month previously in February 1921 at an amateur international in Paris between France and Ireland, where tricolours were held aloft by some fans, and the IFA had those fans removed from the ground. And this did not go down well in Dublin at all, within the Dublin-based media or with supporters and administrators.
So you had people basically representing the IFA, representing people all across the island who had travelled to Paris but had a unionist mentality and completely rejected the idea of a tricolour being flown from a supporter who was supporting an all-island team.
Yeah, but the IFA said that, we're not a political body, but this ran counter to that. It tended to go against symbols of nationalism, whereas playing God Save the King they had no problem with, or flying the Union Jack they had no problem with. So there was this kind of skewing towards unionist or British symbols as opposed to Irish symbols. And then we also had the case of Belfast Celtic, the most nationalist leaning club in Belfast. It always felt it was on the wrong end of in terms of receiving punishment, and it disbanded actually in 1920 for 4 years because of the troubles in Belfast, and the way it felt it was being treated by the IFA. And it's also important to note that even though the IFA claimed there was a lot of violence in Dublin, it seemed to ignore there was a lot more violence amongst civilians in Belfast at the time. In fact, there was a curfew in Belfast for much of this time because of the civilian violence. And one of the administrators, Mr. Beggs, he actually got injured by gunshot wounds. So to say that there was only violence in Dublin and not in Belfast at the time, just beggars belief, considering what was happening in the north at the time.
Because that was their official reason for not going to Shelburne for that 1921 Cup semi-final. It was too dangerous, essentially, was their excuse.
Exactly, and Shelburne said it. Look, we went up to Belfast, and Belfast is in many ways more dangerous than Dublin. So why can't Belfast teams come to Dublin?
What was the story with Belfast Celtic?
Well, there was a lot of sectarian tension in Belfast between Belfast Celtic and some of the unionist-leaning clubs like Linfield and Glentoran, and there was a really ugly incident in 1920. Where there was a huge riot, gunshots were fired. There was a lot of imagery and flags being used of the political situation at the time, and the Belfast Celtic were blamed for that riot, and it actually went to court against the IFA, and ultimately decided look, it was just better to disband whilst the city was so unsettled. So it's kind of moved away from football for those 4 years. But it came back and had a very successful period afterwards until it finally disbanded for good in the late 1940s.
So that period between 1924, you said, and 1940s for Belfast Celtic, there was still an avenue for people under the banner of under the banner not of the IFA, but obviously of those running football from Leinster to actually have a team based in Belfast, so that there was an avenue for the nationalist community within Belfast to have their own team, except for that 4-year window, I assume.
Well, there were other nationalist clubs that sprung up. Actually, former players of Belfast Celtic played for some of those nationalist clubs. In fact, the FAI, which also shows the FAI was not a partitionist body. When it initially was formed as the governing body for all of football in Ireland. And it accepted 23 clubs from the 6 counties, including Alton United. Alton United were a club based in Belfast who had some players who previously played for Belfast Celtic. They actually won the second FAI Cup in 1923 to beat Shelburne in the final. So it actually did accept teams from the north into its fold. However, when it was seeking international recognition, FIFA stipulated that the FAI would have to change its name, first of all, to the Football Association of the Irish Free State, but also it could only allow clubs that were from the 26 counties into its fold. So the 23 clubs that had been in the FAI were no longer part of the FAI from 1923.
Was there a suspicion within the IFA that those running football from Dublin and from Leinster were of a nationalist mindset?
I think maybe there was a suspicion because there certainly were some nationalists, say from an administration point of view, but you'd find whilst most personnel in the IFA Council in Belfast were unionist leaning, it's very different with Leinster Football Association. You had Jewish people there, you had Home Rulers, you had Sinn Féiners, you had Protestants, you had Catholics, so you had a really big mix of different kind of identities within Dublin, more so than you had in Belfast. So I think I didn't see that in the evidence I've seen. I haven't seen much evidence that the Belfast people felt the Dublin administrators were nationalist leaning. They never wanted him to leave, and they tried on many attempts afterwards to get the Dublin people back in, and they actually offered him. And what would have resolved the problem was that if it had been done earlier, they actually gave them equality of status to a large degree only once Leinster left. They should have done that beforehand. They should have given proper representation on, the IFA Council and subcommittees. They should have given more matches to Dublin and more representation for Dublin-based players. If they had done that, there probably wouldn't have been a split. And it could have been resolved from 1921 to 1932 if an agreement had been reached sooner and based more on equality of status between Belfast and Dublin. They were the primary reasons why the split happened in the first place and why it has been maintained since then for the last 100 years.
Why do things change then into the 30s, and why was this situation unsalvageable at that point?
Well, you'd have to blame both, I would say, both associations, not just the IFA. The IFA genuinely wanted United Ireland football team and football organisation. They did give a lot of concessions to the FAI, but there was two conferences where it seemed a deal was close at hand. First of all, in 1924, when the IFA offered the FAI practically equality of status, but the chairman would remain the IFA chairman, they decided in the last minute that they weren't going to accept it. And then in 1932, at the final major conference, it looked like another deal was signed because the chairman would be alternated between Dublin and Belfast, but then the FAI asked that they would get a seat on the International Football Association board. That's the board that still exists today, which makes up the rules for soccer, and which the IFA is still a member of. But then the IFA said, no, you're not getting one of our two seats, and that's when the talks collapsed. The IFA felt there was no point going back to them. The FAI tried a number of attempts in the 30s and other decades, but it became a really frosty relationship between both associations, and it wasn't helped by the fact both jurisdictions were selecting players for both international teams. So you had a situation in 1946 where Jackie Carey, the famous Manchester United player, on the weekend he played for an Ireland team against England from the IFA in Belfast, and then a few days later he played for an Ireland team from Dublin, to an FAI selected team against England in Dublin. So you had that happening quite a bit. And it was only during the Troubles when attempts were made to actually try to see could we get an All Ireland international team. It had about 10 conferences, but the political climate and other factors prevented that from happening.
Very interesting. The IFAB situation there is quite telling of the whole political importance that people had in their own role, I guess, with IFA or with international corporations, that the final straw was taking one of our two international seats, and with the big boys. I don't know where their headquarters is, London or somewhere else in maybe Switzerland somewhere. But that was the thing that stuck in the craw of the IFA, is telling about the notions, I guess, of the football administrators at the time.
Yeah, it does. But in fairness, I know my issue with the FAI in asking for that extra seat was they asked for it at the very last moment when a deal had almost been signed. But it was legitimate for them to ask for that seat, because if they hadn't asked for it, then they would have been, minnows in many respects to the IFA, and that was their reasoning for asking for it. They wanted total equality of status between Dublin and Belfast, and in fact, they could argue they had more right to more equality because the area they governed was far bigger in size than the north. But obviously, the IFA was an old established body with very strong relationships with the FAs in England, Scotland, and Wales, and it didn't want to relinquish any of its power or its kind of contacts as well.
It must have been pretty frustrating to be an Irish football fan around that time, seeing things like the World Cup take off and FIFA take off, and throughout the 30s and 40s, for the majority of the 40s anyway, not even being allowed to play some of the home nations in inverted commas until the British associations, I think, in 1946 officially recognised the FAI in a way that allows them to actually play games against Ireland.
Yeah, well, the British FAs actually recognised the FAI in late 1923, but they give them dominion status, which meant that the IFA was seen as the full association for Ireland and could select Irish players. And that was the reason why England, Scotland and Wales would not play an FAI Irish team. But also the British associations had their own problems with FIFA as well. First of all, they didn't. They actually left FIFA when the Central Powers after the First World War were allowed back into FIFA soon after the First World War. And secondly, in late 1920s, 1928, they also left FIFA again, because there was some haziness in relation to the amateur rule. FIFA allowed players who got time off work were given expenses. That was seen as professionalism by the British Association, so they actually left. So they weren't in FIFA until after the Second World War. And the Irish, the FAI decided not to send a team to Uruguay for the first World Cup. They could have. There was only 13 teams in that World Cup, and they decided it was too expensive, and they didn't send the team. And they actually lost out to Norway in qualifying for 1934 World Cup. So they had a very, very late entries to the World Cup, as you know, not until 1990 getting to the competition. Whereas Northern Ireland had a very successful tournament in 58 and 82.
God, that's in hindsight. Where was the fundraising team at for that 1930 World Cup?
Exactly. Well, it would have been great because any team that participated in it, benefited from it. I think there was 4 teams from Europe, and even the King of Romania paid for the Romanian squad to go there. So it was certainly, on hindsight, they certainly should have made a lot more effort to. And even in 1950, they could have had a chance to go to the World Cup, and they would have made a lot of money out of that, and they turned that down as well. So there was a few missed opportunities for the Irish team there at World Cups.
And was that team in 1930 or 1950 any good? Would they have could they have been the precursor to the great Irish teams of the 80s and 90s?
Well, I think they would have been okay, yeah, because they did quite well against teams like Belgium, the Netherlands in the late 20s. Obviously, football had originated in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland pretty much before anywhere else. So they would have been playing, a lot of those players, or would have been playing against good competition. Obviously, a lot of those players were in clubs in England as well, in Scotland. So definitely would have had an advantage over some of the continental teams. They played Italy a couple of times in the late 1920s, and I think they lost on both occasions. But Italy obviously won 2 World Cups in a row, in 1934.
Yeah, so they were putting their weights up against some of the best in the world at that point. Just to bring this full
English, obviously we have to add a caveat. At that time, the British associations weren't in those tournaments, so
sure.
But they were under splendid isolation and felt they were superior to every other country. But obviously, once they did enter the World Cup, they got kicked out of the first round, losing to the USA. England did in 1950. So.
Yeah, a real tragedy, that one. So just to bring this full circle then, 1921, this month, 100 years ago, that Cup semi-final and that Shelbourne versus Glenavon game, which precedes the Irish soccer split. What happens thereafter? Who actually wins that Irish Cup, actually, is one question I had to finish up on.
Yeah, they're actually at Glentoran.
Glentoran, right.
Glenavon got to the final because Shelbourne were disqualified, and Glentoran won 2-0 against Glenavon.
Right. And was that Shelbourne team any good thereafter? Do you remember, or do you know rather?
Yeah, I think they didn't win many early leagues or FAI Cups, but they had won the Irish Cup in 1920, the year before. Right. So they would have assumed if Glenavon came to Dublin, they would have won that, and then they would have played Glentoran in the final. So there would have been a good chance for him to retain the trophy. Who knows? But how good they could have been, or what they could have achieved in an All Ireland kind of Irish Football League basis. But as I said, they did lose the FAI Cup final in 1923 against Alton United, which was a huge shock at the time.
Right. Well, Cormac, this is fascinating stuff as ever. It's great catching up with you. Just a reminder as well, The Irish Soccer Split is your book. People can check that out if they give it a Google. They can get it on all the regular online bookstores.
And it's actually been republished in paperback format. It should be available in the next couple of weeks. So the 100th anniversary edition.
Brilliant. And make sure to give Cormac a follow on Twitter as well. I'm sure we'll catch up again over the next little while. The contemporary version of this conversation is one that pops up every now and again. And sure, don't we have a joint World Cup to look at over the next couple of years as well?
The 100th anniversary of the World Cup in Ireland and Britain. It's going to be great.
Cormac Moore, thanks a million.
Thanks, Owen.